That the American media is heavily biased barely requires debate at this point. There are few political beliefs these days which command widespread consensus among Americans, but contempt for the corporate media and a recognition that they are more guided by a political agenda than a desire for truthful reporting are beliefs most Americans share. As a Gallup 2022 survey found under the headline, "Americans' Trust in Media Remains Near Record Low," quote, at 34%, Americans trust the mass media to report the news, quote, fairly, accurately, and fully, is essentially unchanged from last year and just 2 points higher than the lowest that Gallup has recorded in 2016 during the presidential campaign. Just 7% of Americans, 7% have, quote, a great deal of trust and confidence in the media, and 27% have a, quote, fair amount. Meanwhile, 28% of U.S. adults said they do not have very much confidence, and 38% have none at all in newspapers, TV, and radio. Notably, this is the first time that the percentage of Americans with no trust at all in the media is higher than the percentage with a great deal or a fair amount combined. But the question of which political agenda they serve is a bit more elusive. Many conservatives insist the answer is easy. The media is devoted to political liberalism. Rush Limbaugh spent decades ranting against what he called the liberal media. And throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the conservative perception of the corporate media was rather straightforward and clear. The narrative went, journalists are Democrats, they believe in liberalism, they are devoted to the advancement of the political left. Whether that was really as true then is more a question for history. I would submit that, like most things these days, a simple, traditional left versus right framework is really not the best metric for understanding the media's allegiances. It is definitely true, clearly so, observably so, that employees of American media corporations support the left liberal views on culture war issues. That's not hard to understand why that is. Employees of NBC, CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the like live in big blue cities on the East Coast. They attend the same schools as each other and circulate in the same social enclaves. So on standard culture war questions, LGBT rights, abortion, gender ideology, and gender roles, dogma about race and racism, there's almost certainly an overwhelming consensus in favor of left liberal politics. That is almost certainly why the small amounts of lingering trust the U.S. media has managed to preserve come overwhelmingly from American Democrats and liberals. As the 2022 Gallup report found, quote, America's trust in the media remains sharply polarized among partisan lines, with 70% of Democrats, 14% of Republicans, and 27% of independents saying they have a great deal or fair amount of confidence. There has been a consistent double-digit gap in trust between Democrats and Republicans since 2001, and that gap has ranged from 54 to 63 percentage points since 2017. The accompanying chart from Gallup is remarkably illustrative, and it reveals the following, quote, as you can see, basically the approval of corporate media is now almost entirely dependent on Democratic Party voters. If we can bring back that chart, there you see that starting essentially in 2016, there was a radical jump in trust that Democrats have for the corporate media, largely because they perceived correctly that the corporate media was almost entirely on their side in trying to sabotage Donald Trump and advance the interests of the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, the trend line of both independents and Republicans when it comes to trust in the media has steadily declined since 1974 and is now basically in full-scale collapse. It is hard to overstate how dependent the corporate media now is on Democrats when it comes to retaining any degree of trust. If not for Democrats, these numbers would be way, way worse, drastically lower. 70% of Democrats trust the corporate media in the United States. So out of every 10 Democrats, 7 of them trust the corporate media, compared to 2.7 independents out of every 10 and 1.5 Republicans. People trust media when they perceive that they're on their side or at least trying to do a fair job. And since the emergence of Trump, that is true only of Democrats. But on questions of economic policy, and especially foreign policy, the bias that shapes corporate media is not really so much about left versus right or Democrat versus Republican. To begin with, the establishment wings of both parties are far more driven by agreement with one another on fundamental economic and foreign policy questions than they are in disagreement. Both parties, for example, were highly in favor of and excited by shooting down the Chinese balloon hovering over the United States, despite not really knowing for sure what it was. With the only difference being, although it was fervently expressed, that conservatives were angry at Biden for allowing the military to wait until it was over water rather than immediately shooting it down without regard to risk to people on the ground, while Republicans wanted it shot down immediately upon detection. These are not exactly fundamental and radical differences when to shoot down a Chinese balloon. And that repeats itself across the major debates over economic and foreign policy. As President Obama said in one of his most perceptive and astute speeches about the maximalist narratives coming from the Republican Party, he said, the script against me is wildly overstated because essentially we're all guardians of the status quo. As he put it, we're all playing within the 40-yard lines of the establishment wings in the Republican and Democratic Party establishment. He was often confounded and actually sad that the Republican Party looked at him as what he most definitely was not, which was a radical, when he was essentially saying, look, the differences between us, between me and Mitch McConnell, between me and Paul Ryan, are not radical at all. They're small and even trivial. We're all fighting within the 40-yard line. A little bit more of this, a little bit more of that, but in essence, we agree on our foundational views on foreign and American policy. And for that reason, far more than liberalism or conservatism or devotion to one of the two political parties has become the main ideology of the media. It's really driven instead by allegiance to status quo power and institutional authorities. Above all else, what the corporate media wants is the agenda of institutions of authority and major power centers to be preserved and protected and advanced. That is one of the major reasons why one of the most important events in the history of media took place in the 1950s and 1960s when major media outlets became corporatized. They were no longer owned by trusted families who had newspapers passed down throughout the generations. Instead, they became swallowed up by gigantic corporations. And that's what large corporations do more than anything else. They are, by definition, inside the halls of power. They are aligned with governments and aligned with corporate agendas. They worship credentialism and authority. To thrive in corporations, in large corporations, the characteristic you most need is not that you are a dissident to establishment orthodoxies, but that you are there to prove that you can efficiently advance it. Those are the personalities and characteristics which cause you to advance and succeed in any large corporation. And when media became a part of large corporations, the media itself became corporatized. It adopted, even more so than ever before, a pro-authority or pro-status quo perspective. To the extent that there is any real Democratic versus Republican allegiance that drives the media, it was almost entirely due to Trump. The media has largely been fine with standard Republicans in the past, people like George Bush and Dick Cheney, or even going back before that. They never liked Barry Goldwater because he was too extremist. He was a threat to establishment orthodoxies, and that's the same reason why they hated Trump. The media hated Trump not because he's a Republican, but because he ran on opposition to Republican orthodoxy, and therefore institutions of authority and power hated Trump, and therefore these journalists inside media corporations did as well. That is how they think about the world. But above all else, their real allegiance is to U.S. security state and therefore to more war. That is the one common denominator that they all have. There was a perception back in 2001 and 2002 that the media was anti-Bush and anti-Cheney. And again, I'm going to leave that to history. I think it's quite disputable. If you look at the 2000 election, for example, the media loved to try and turn it into a question of with whom would you rather have a beer, George W. Bush or Al Gore. They kind of liked Bush, just they found him a more likable person. Gore was notoriously kind of hectoring and alienating. He had a very cold personality the media disliked. And they often openly acknowledged that they found Bush more appealing, that they had a warmer sensation to George Bush. But when it came to the war on terror and the Iraq War, the kind of liked Bush, just they found him a more likable person. I think people have forgotten how quickly the U.S. media united behind that entire Bush-Cheney agenda. A very big reason why the war in Iraq and the war on terror generally was able to be sold not only to conservatives who naturally supported it because it was being sponsored by the Republican Party under Bush and Cheney, but large numbers of the sector of American liberalism, to the point that 80% of Americans approved of George W. Bush throughout the end of 2001 and into 2002, and 70% or more of Americans supported the Iraq War at the time that it was launched, was because there had been so much penetration of support for the Bush-Cheney neocon war on terror and Iraq War into sectors of American liberalism, and that was led by the American liberal media. It would have been impossible to convert 70% of Americans into supporters of the war on terror and the Iraq War without having not Fox News behind that agenda, although they certainly were, but without having the most trusted liberal voices: Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, John Kerry, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the New Yorker. The journals that liberals trusted the most were completely unified behind every proposed new war. They loved it. And to this day, that more than anything is their most predictable attribute. Outside of the culture war, where they're reliably left liberal, for the reasons I described, the demographic reasons, when it comes to the more substantive questions of economic policy and foreign policy, they're not leftists as much as they are devotees to status quo power and institutional authority. And it's almost impossible to overstate how pro-war the employees of large media corporations have always been. And that's the reason why the only place one can now find dissent and opposition to things like the war in Ukraine, and even the attempt to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and before that, the regime change operation undertaken by NATO to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, came from Fox News. There's a sector of the American right, the populist right in media, that is more anti-war than any other sector of the media, which continues to be as fervently and passionately in favor of any new war that's on the table. And to demonstrate just how impossible it is to overstate that, I want to show you an interview that Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky did with CNN host Kate Baldwin in 2017, when the media was indignant over Donald Trump's refusal to do much more than he was doing to engage in regime change in Syria. They had watched what happened in Iraq, where we overthrew the regime of Saddam Hussein, and in its wake brought nothing other than extreme chaos and instability in the region that even Tony Blair acknowledges is what gave rise to ISIS. It brought almost no benefit to the United States. The Iraqi governments that were elected were far more favorable to Iran than they were to the United States. They were far more favorable to Iran than Saddam Hussein was. They strengthened Iran, they strengthened ISIS. Even after watching everything that happened in that Iraq war, they were desperate to due to Syria, what they did to Iraq, which was overthrow Bashar al-Assad, even though obviously Assad was not in any way threatening the United States. And anybody who even expressed any kind of hesitation was despised openly by the media. So let me show you this interview. It was actually Congressman Massie himself who reminded me. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.